Hello, everyone, and welcome to this opening day of Irving's Investing in Our Energy Futures Conference, which is being jointly hosted by the Irving Institute of Energy and Society and the Thayer School of Engineering's Great Issues in Energy series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexis Abramson, and I became the Dean of the Thayer School of Engineering in 2019. As an engineering researcher and professor, I've been in the energy field for over 20 years. I started off focusing my work on nanoscale energy transport and have grown it to look at building energy efficiency and other related technologies. I'm also the co-founder of a building energy efficiency startup called Edifice Analytics that was born from an ARPA-E award to create an ability to do virtual energy audits, which has become very attractive, virtual energy audits due to the pandemic and the situation we find ourselves in today. Prior to Dartmouth, just prior to Dartmouth, I took a sabbatical at Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a venture capital firm that was started by Bill Gates and his colleagues to really focus on investing in startup companies with a significant potential to mitigate climate change. And I've served there as a technical advisor for a couple of years. And in my current role as Dean of Engineering at Dartmouth, I'm really eager to continue to engage in energy education, research, and practice here on campus, as well as beyond. And I really think that that beyond part is just so important. We really are at an inflection point for change in our world. We feel this strongly in the energy sector. We feel it just as strong in higher education. And even at the intersection of these two important areas with topics such as racial injustice and economic equality. And these problems are just too complex to solve in silos. They really do require many disciplines to cross-pollinate and figure out how do we solve these complex and staggering problems facing humanity. And in particular, our focus today on how we address issues and opportunities regarding our energy transformation. So this partnership between the Irving Institute of Energy and Society and the Thayer School of Engineering is incredibly powerful because we're bringing technology together with social science and policy and design and other disciplines. And I truly believe that the magic will happen at the intersections of all of these things after all. And it also will happen when we truly and fully consider the humans as we strive for those solutions to these problems. So that is why at the Thayer School of Engineering, our focus is not just on engineering, but on human-centered engineering and integrating that into our education, our research, and our practice. And so before we get started with our panel, I just wanted to mention that I am sitting here in my office at Thayer, and just over my right shoulder is the construction of the new Irving building. So if you'll indulge me, I'm gonna pick up my webcam just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on. So you can see some cranes there. You can see just the side of the Irving Institute building. Doesn't really do it justice when you're coming up Tuck Drive. You certainly see it much better in its grandeur. But it's something that I get to experience every day, seeing the progression of the construction project when I'm in the office, and it's just been so exciting to see that sort of rise before my eyes. So again, welcome to all of you for being here. A welcome to our panelists as well. Joining us today is Abby Ross Hopper. She is the president and CEO of Solar Energy Industries Association. Also Tom Kiernan, who's the CEO of American Rivers. Darren Pierce, who's an analyst at Capital Group. And Brad Plumer, who's the climate reporter at the New York Times. Their full bios are available online. So we're going to keep it brief so we can jump into important questions and discussions with our panelists. So I want to note you who are joining us today, if you have questions that you would like to ask of our presenters, then please submit them using the Q&A feature. We'll also be allowing time for Q&A at the end of the program. So So we're here with these esteemed panelists to discuss the strategies needed to optimize technological innovation and technology deployment and social adaptation to help ensure a sustainable future for the world. We're going to look to our panelists to help us explore possible roadmaps to really think about leveraging emerging technologies, about the potential for various energy generation and management technologies, and the role of legacy energy resources as well. So given this theme, and maybe to start us off, I'd like to ask a question and get thoughts from each of you. So maybe we'll start off by really considering sort of what's emerging on the energy transformation landscape, probably with respect to technologies, or it could be business models, it could be investment strategies, it could be policies, but really what's emerging on the horizon with respect to the energy transformation happening before our eyes. And where do you really see the potential to have an impact? So how do we move these emerging technologies or policies or business models or strategies? How do we move them into the marketplace to achieve a sustainable energy future? And if you have a specific example, panelists, I'd be thrilled to hear about that as well. So let's go ahead. Tom, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and start with you, and we'll move to our other panelists as well.
Thank you, Alexis. Happy to jump in, and it's great to join the panel and the audience and virtually be back at Dartmouth. Couple thoughts that I would start with. First, by way of, let me just say a minute about background. Before running American Rivers, I was the head of the American Wind Energy Association. And the reason I say that is I was working renewable energy with Abby Hopper. She and I, close colleagues doing renewable. I'm now running American Rivers and working with the hydro industry. And the reason I just say that as a backdrop, and Alexis, it kind of gets to your point, I think there's so much excitement at the intersection of different technologies and sectors. The fact that I was, all of a couple months ago, running a trade association in renewables, and now I'm sitting on the, if you will, the other side of the table from the hydro industry, talking about river conservation and endangered species and fish habitat and river restoration, I think allows me to more effectively partner with the industries in advancing technology. So my main point, and I'll leave it to others, is for technological innovation, the more we can have people cross-pollinate and understand different dimensions, different sectors, the more creative I think we can be.
That's great. Thanks, Tom. Darren, how about to you?
Sure. Thanks, Alexis. Also wonderful to be with you today. Wonderful to, like Tom said, to be back at Dartmouth, even if it's only virtually. It's a fascinating and really exciting time to be involved in energy, because there is so much change going on, and these are tough problems, but there's also some really interesting potential solutions, some of which are economic today. So for instance, wind and solar now, onshore wind and solar are economic in many parts of the world, and certainly here in the US. Other things that will be deployed to help reduce carbon emissions, things like nature-based offsets, carbon capture and sequestration, renewable fuels, renewable diesel from waste cooking oils, particularly interesting, green hydrogen, still fairly uneconomic, but certainly has a lot of potential. We can talk more about that. Battery technology, something that's been, difficult for decades upon decades, but more dollars are being poured into R&D today, and really some interesting strides are being made. Solid state, for instance, and some of the work that's being done there. So there is just a myriad of potential solutions. I think it will take multiple solutions in order to truly tackle emissions over the next number of decades, but there's a lot of interesting opportunities.
So a quick follow-up on that, Darren, from your vantage point, right, on sort of the investing side of things too, is there certain technologies you think are still emerging, but sooner to sort of hit the marketplace rather than some of the others that you mentioned?
Well, there's we're at an interesting intersection right now where there is, like I said, some technologies that are economic or very close to economic. Offshore wind, I would say, is not quite economic, but it's so close that with some government help, it's essentially there and continuing to work its way down the cost curve. Electric vehicles, are subsidized still, but you're essentially close to parity and continuing to work down the cost curve there as well. So those are interesting. Hydrogen's one that, at least in the sphere that I operate in, in the public markets, a tremendous amount of hype and hope, but a lot of work to be done on coming down that cost curve. And, I think that's really a multi-decade type of path still to where you're truly at a level where it can compete against other solutions.
Great, thanks. And what about you, Brad? Thoughts on what's emerging?
Yeah, one thing I feel like Darren did such a good job of running through so many of the technologies that are on the horizon. One thing I found that is really interesting is how the sort of the policy landscape around climate policy has really changed as a result. So, 15 years ago, when I started out covering climate policy in Washington, it felt like a big idea was Congress would get together, pass some big climate plan, maybe a cap and trade bill or something like that, fund some research, and then the technologies would emerge that would help solve the problem. And that was sort of the model for how it was going. And what happened, that bill never passed. We never really got a sort of comprehensive climate policy, but in the background, thanks to smaller policies that got less notice at the time, state efforts, the efforts of engineers and private companies and all sorts of innovators, a bunch of different clean energy technologies have emerged that really surprised people. So, solar, Aimee would know the exact numbers, but it's like, the cost has fallen like 99% from a certain time. Wind has just seen dramatic declines. Batteries, it's been incredible. And that's now shaping what sort of policymakers think is possible. It's incredible that you think back 15 years and there are a lot of utilities that would say, if we had more than a little bit of wind or solar onto the grid, the whole thing's going to collapse. We can't do it, no way. And now you have all these utilities pledging to go, 70, 80% emissions reduction, even without government mandates. You have states that are talking about 100% clean electricity. There's just so much that's been learned about how to add more wind and solar to the grid and keep the lights on, keep things running, that it's really changed how policymakers think about the problem. So I feel like that's such an interesting feedback we're really seeing is as these solutions emerge, it completely changes what companies set as goals, what policymakers are willing to talk about. The Biden administration right now is at least talking about 100% clean electricity standard. And I feel like that wouldn't have happened without the sort of surge of technologies we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. So I think it's going to be exciting to see how that continues to evolve going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, right, there's this interplay between technologies that maybe have been around for a while, like solar and wind, right, and see how much they're capturing the market, but then also sort of you mentioned hydrogen, right? What's going to happen with hydrogen in the next 10 years? And it's more emerging and a real huge opportunity if we can make that work. But so it'll be interesting to see kind of where we land 10 years from now even. Aimee, how about turning to you? Your thoughts on what's emerging, technologies, policy, all of that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I felt like the biggest part of my resume that didn't get mentioned is that I'm in '93. I know a lot of us are alums, but usually at any Dartmouth event, that's like the first moniker.
You're getting in trouble, Aimee.
No, I
It was
would
on the
never.
slide. It was on the slide, I promise. So
I promise. I was, yeah. So anyway, I do very much wish I was in Hanover right now. I'm coming to you from Northwest Washington, DC, Northwest Washington, DC. I would add my voice to what Brad said. I mean, you know, I'm a lawyer by training. I'm gonna leave the technology to the engineers like you. But what I see in terms of innovation is the discussion, right? The discussion and the conversation in the realm of the possible is what is so dramatically different. And so as prices have come down, as market penetration has increased, what I see as the real transformative moment is that there is no longer a question of whether our energy system is going to change. I think there is broad consensus that it is and will continue to do so, and that decarbonization is the goal. And it's really a conversation about how quickly is that transformation going to happen, and sort of what's the appropriate role of government in assisting or hampering that transition. And so, as Brad said, that's a whole different kind of conversation than whether it will happen or how we incent one particular technology. I would say in the last few months, right, maybe since January 20th or so, the other transformative thing I have witnessed is a whole of government approach to the climate crisis. And I say that with all due love and respect to the prior administration, like all of the prior administrations. I don't mean that as a knock against anybody. I just think that there has been a real deepening of our understanding about both the crisis in front of us and the various levers that governments have to influence this. So that the obvious ones are obvious, right? Tax policy and those sorts of things. And Tom and I could talk about that in our sleep. But if you think about, you know, the Treasury Department have a climate advisor and thinking about disclosures, right? Like what kind of climate disclosures do public companies need to make? Or the USDA thinking about that, or DOD thinking about how their assets are impacted by climate and how they address climate. And so when I say the whole of government, I really do mean that. I'm not myopic in terms of the federal government, but state government and local governments as well. There is just a real understanding that this is something voters want, you know, constituents want, and there's bipartisan support for it. And so that, from my seat, is what's really transformed over the past few years.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, we
Alexis,
definitely.
can I jump in one quick
Absolutely,
comment?
Tom, go ahead.
I strongly support this whole spectrum of what people have said on the panel of the technologies. One thing that was missing, I think, or at least I didn't hear, transmission. We do need, yes, you know, whether it's hydrogen, batteries, all the new technologies, offshore wind, et cetera, siting new transmission, which is desperately needed to get renewables from, especially wind from Midwest to load, or offshore, onshore, solar from some big arrays. To siting transmission is really hard. We need some innovation of technology there, but we need some societal evolution in how we site transmission, because we will not succeed without more transmission. And right now it takes 8, 10, 12 years for new transmission. So I just wanted to highlight that challenge. It's different than new technology, but it's a big barrier.
Really important. So Tom, do you see that as, well, with good policy, we're going to overcome that? Or is there really more to it than that?
I think it's a combination. There are, now to speak on the other side of it, some technologies for better using the existing grid that we have. So there are some software and hardware tools to better use the lines we've got. That's good. But I do think, yes, we need to come up with some additional incentives and some new policies. For example, right now, if you have a couple of states all saying, yes, we want this transmission line to cut across these states, and one state decides not to make a decision or oppose it, that line's dead. And that just invariably, that's going to happen. So it's a combination of policies, incentives, yes, some technology. And right now, there's not a good strategy for how we're going to deploy more transmission. So that's a big challenge for us.
Really, really good point. Very critical. So as we think about, you know, all of these things, I think we've been talking about affect humans in various ways. So I mentioned in the beginning at Thayer, we're really focused on human-centered engineering. And so I think of that has a lot of different meaning around it. So as we think about the energy transformation, and we think about the human piece of this, and many of you touched on this, right? We think about how is this energy transformation going to affect humans, right, in the planet, right, in positive and negative ways. We also want to be kind of mindful of, as we're designing new technologies or solving some of these problems like transmission, right, the NIMBY problem, right, the not in my backyard problem, right, the banana problem. There's all these acronyms now, but right, are we really thinking about the humans, and then not just keeping our fingers crossed that people are okay putting these transmission lines in their backyard, but really trying to find solutions that people are going to be comfortable with. But then also there's the other human piece, right, as we think about energy equity, and as we think about social justice around equity, and the disparities in economics, right, that impact access to energy, especially access to clean energy. I would love to hear from any of you, just jump in, sort of your thoughts around how we maybe moving forward think more about the humans as part of the solution. I don't know if doing it the same way we did it before is going to work. We probably have to come up with some new strategies, again, on the technology, on the design side, on the policy side, right? Ideas around that?
I'm happy to go first.
Go ahead, Abby.
One of the things I like the most about the Irving Institute is that it's for like energy and society, right? So it really incorporates the fact that this is a living organism with people involved that we're thinking about. And I appreciate that you said that, Dean, about Thayer as well, and that it's people-centered engineering. And I think about it in a couple of ways. Certainly, who are the customers, right? Who enjoys the benefits of clean energy? How are clean energy projects cited and where are they cited? But also, what does our workforce look like? Because if we're talking about, in the solar industry alone, if we want to meet President Biden's goals, we're going to have over 1 million people employed in solar. We're 250,000 now. So what does that workforce look like, right? Who owns those businesses? I'm not just interested in who the laborer is, but who's the CEO, right? who's creating wealth in this energy revolution, basically. And so one of the things that we have done is think about the policy front, right? Like, how do we center communities that have been impacted and oftentimes not included in these conversations? Like, what does that look like? And that's a real different way of setting policy priorities and engaging communities and listening to stakeholders. I mean, we've all gone to I'll speak for myself, the stakeholder meeting that's held at 4 p.m. in a downtown hotel in the middle of a workday. That's not stakeholder engagement, but it checks the box, right? Like the regulatory box. And so thinking about going where people are and not just listening, but actually giving them a full and empowered, seeing them as full partners, not just another, check the box. So I'm personally really excited about what this means for us, but it is definitely a different way of doing business. I could talk a lot about workforce development. I won't, but I think there's just tons of opportunity there as well to be much more intentional about how we share what the benefits are of this clean energy job transition. And make sure that the diversity of our workforce reflects the diversity of our country.
Great points. Thanks, Abby. Darren?
Yeah, there's one aspect of this that has a really, I think, a very important human element. Let's just step back and talk about this on a global scale. There's 1 billion people in the world that don't have electricity today, and there's another 3 billion people that don't have access to clean fuels for cooking. So they use wood and they use charcoal and they use coal to cook. And the reason they do that is because it's the cheapest thing available. And there's a reason we use hydrocarbons so predominantly. It's because they've been cheap and affordable. And as we go through these transitions, some of these solutions are more expensive, and that creates a tension. And I think if you're not aware of that tension and the implications, especially to those who are struggling just to pay the rent, then we set ourselves up for failure. So how we deal with that, and an equitable split of who pays for these transitions, I think is important. But one thing, in all of that, it's also clear to me, I saw this pop up on the question list, the role of conservation. One of the things we try and do, or policy has done to date, is we try and hide the cost of this. For instance, biodiesel, renewable diesel in California is subsidized to the tune of about $3 a gallon. And that's expensive, right? But we'd use a lot less of it if we're actually paying more for that diesel, that gasoline stream. We would transition quicker if we bore the full brunt of a carbon price. These are complex issues for sure. And how you split, equitably the cost of this transition, that's something I think if young people are thinking of getting into the policy debate, that is going to be a huge challenge over the next decade.
Yeah, it sounds like, also maybe what we've done in the past oftentimes is kind of look at discrete parts of the problem and the solution, right? Rather than looking at it more holistically. And I think you're certainly suggesting the latter. So, Tom?
Just wanted to jump on, I think, Darren, you may have used the word, there's going to be some tension, if I recall correct. I just want to expand on that for a moment. There's going to be massive tension. There's a battle ongoing. Yes, we're moving towards clean energy, and yes, it's going to happen. But I don't want to minimize the fact there are some existing stakeholders deeply embedded in oil and gas and other infrastructure. So it's, if you're getting into energy, if you're getting into these issues, buckle up. This is tough stuff. And there are battles. This is going to be wild, and a lot of societal challenges, winners and losers. And I hate to say that, but this is tough, and all the equity issues you've been raising. It's not going to be easy or pretty. So I don't know, maybe that's glasses half empty kind of view, but it's going to be tough going.
I am happy to see that we're talking about it and having those conversations like Abby mentioned earlier, right? So the discussions, that's where we got to start there at least. So, and hopefully it gets less messy and less tension filled as we move forward. That's the hope, right? So good. I'm going to turn to some of the questions coming in from our audience here. Maybe one kind of theme that I see emerging here has to do with these new technologies or newish technologies. I think, wind and solar falling into that category in particular, and how those new technologies are impacting or could impact grid stability, right? And so do we have to think about that? And then kind of to add on to it, I think picking up on some of our audience members, picking up on Tom's comments about transmission, right? And as we think about grid stability and challenges with transmission, then why not be more distributed? Why not try and push more distributed energies if there's some concern around that? So maybe Tom, if I can put you on the spot and turn to you first, that would be great. Yeah,
just a quick thought. Agree with that point that distributed solutions are absolutely part of the solution here. So we need more distributed resources, whether it's solar, batteries, et cetera. And utility scale wind in many parts of the country is far and away, even with the cost of transmission, the cheapest source of new electricity in many parts of the country. So my point is, yes, distributed solutions. And to really get 70, 80, 90%, 100% clean energy, we're going to need new transmission as well. So it's a kind of all of the above type approach.
Great. Good. I'm also seeing a theme here around nuclear energy, and that touches in so many ways on the technology side and sort of some interest in modular nuclear. And there's some really interesting startups emerging in the nuclear space, right? whereas before you saw more the large companies kind of in that space. But then certainly touches on policy aspects, and then also bringing back that human piece, right? Human perception, and then of the potential risk and buy-in potentially, which influences your policy. And then thinking as well as about the risk around the waste, and then the risk like we saw many years ago now in Fukushima. So any thoughts? Have any of you been looking at nuclear recently and have any thoughts to share on that? Brad?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, right now in the US, the biggest challenge for the nuclear power industry in terms of building new plants is just the cost. The cost has really gotten out of control. Right now, Georgia is the only state still building nuclear reactors, and those suffered quite a few delays and cost overruns, and it looks like they will probably complete them, but that's about it for this generation of nuclear reactors. It's just been a big problem, and the reasons for that are pretty complex. You can cite everything from the fact that various regulations changed over time. There have often been problems in sort of beginning construction before the designs and full plans were complete. But also, these are just big, right now, nuclear reactors are big, multi-billion-dollar projects. And they're hard to do. Whenever there are delays, that just means the finance sort of balloons for them. So it's tough right now to see the sort of current generation of nuclear reactors continuing to be built, unless some new administration comes along and says we're just going to plow an enormous amount of money into this. But right now that doesn't seem like it's on the table. So the two big nuclear policy issues right now that are really interesting are, one, what do we do about the nuclear reactors we already have? Because those are about 20% of the nation's electricity, pretty much zero emissions electricity. Every time nuclear reactors have closed so far, they've mostly been replaced with natural gas so far, and emissions have gone up. So a few states have started to look at this and said, okay, well, if we're serious about climate, it's a little crazy to close those early. So places like New York, Illinois, New Jersey, I'm forgetting one. Oh, Ohio. Ohio kind of had like a weird scandal-ridden bill, but they decide we're going to give these power plants that are clean energy some policy support to stay open longer, because it doesn't make sense to close them early and let them get replaced by natural gas. So that's one I suspect we'll continue to see debates over in the years ahead. And then the other is this really interesting question of whether small modular nuclear reactors can sort of solve this problem of big multi-billion-dollar nuclear reactors being too tough to construct and finance in this era. And that feels like a little bit of, we kind of have to wait and see. There are a couple interesting, NuScale is a company that has a sort of smaller version of the light water reactor. They're hoping to build one by the mid-2020s. There are, as you mentioned, a bunch of other smaller startups. Oklo is an interesting one that's trying to build really tiny nuclear reactors that could almost be a replacement for diesel generators. They're going through the regulatory process. That it feels a little bit like we'll have to wait to see what the NRC says and if they can build them and if they can bring down the cost and if the policy support can be there. But that feels like a more plausible way forward, barring some huge shift in the policy environment that certainly Biden hasn't talked about, and even the Trump administration wasn't quite there.
Yeah, it's been noticeably absent from the Biden conversation on nuclear. So, Darren, were you trying to chime in there, or did Brad steal your thunder a little? No, we're good.
Oh, I think he covered it.
Okay, that's fine. Good. I'm also seeing in the questions some mention of the utilities, and we've touched on that a little bit here and there. So, utility companies, there's some variation across the country, I will say, but they're kind of thought of as still being in the dinosaur age, right? Very slow to change. And there are some good reasons for that. Maybe we haven't set them up very well to respond quickly. I'm just curious to hear a little more about how you see the role of utilities maybe changing or needing to change in the future. Any thoughts on that?
I would certainly concur with your assessment that not every utility is created equally or has evolved equally. That being said, I mean, we need to recognize that utilities are government sanctioned monopolies, right? Like that is not a political statement, that is a statement of fact, right? We give them a franchise, they don't face competition necessarily. So as you said, they have a business model that is built one way. Obviously, when we try to deregulate, we try to bring in a little bit of competition on the generation side, but it's still that the existing utility is still a monopoly. And so we're big believers in the free market, and that competition will ultimately be better for consumers. And so I think, I won't opine on utilities per se, other than to say that I think ensuring that markets remain competitive and that there are, innovators and new entrepreneurs and new business models and new technologies can have a space to operate and compete, bring better value, bring lower prices, bring new products to consumers. That's the important part. I mean, I think that's the goal most people would agree with, and then you get specific and then it goes haywire. But sort of this idea that competition is ultimately better for consumers is an important one. And it sounds sort of esoteric, but I will tell you on a daily basis in my work life, this is an issue, right? In the great state of North Carolina, which is I don't think very much, is mostly held by an incumbent a utility and a monopoly, how do solar producers compete in that marketplace with access to those customers? Or how do, and so there's a federal law and that's how, but that requires competition. And so I saw there were a bunch of questions about distributed generation, right? Like, how do utilities accommodate the fact that a lot of their customers, corporate customers, residential customers, want to install solar on their homes? And sort of how do they adjust to that business model? So I think appreciating that competition is an important value, as well as clean energy being an important value, is the path to greatest likelihood of success for this transformation.
So maybe I can dig into that a lot, because as you mentioned, there's some questions on this. So do you foresee, I guess I'm asking you to have a crystal ball here, Abby, so forgive me for that, but do you foresee, right, there we go. Do you foresee, the utilities having the ability to change much with respect to distributed energy? And I'm thinking your example of solar in particular, right? Some consumers, until, net metering gets figured out in their particular state, they're like, I'm not touching solar, right? So do you see that the federal government's going to be able to help move along some utilities or states that are slow to kind of change in that way? Or what's the sort of magic formula that needs to be implemented in order to sort of make it such that it's attractive to do more distributed energy?
Yeah, I'll happily give my opinion. I'd be really curious what others think. I think what I know from regulating utilities in a former life is that they do care deeply about their customers, and that relationship is fairly sacred. And so customers demanding change and demanding clean energy products and demanding storage and demanding flexibility and how they procure those resources, I think is what will continue to push utilities that are a little bit more cautious into that realm. And so I can't quite overstate, Tom can talk about the wind side, but certainly on the solar side, the corporate procurement of solar and solar plus storage assets and corporates requiring that before they will take large economic development projects into a state has really transformed the marketplace, right? And so utilities that maybe thought, I don't really care that much about it, now are getting a call from their governor saying, well, I mean, I don't know if they're going to get a call from their governor. I'm just assuming they're going to get a call from their governor that says, I want Corporation X to come and spend X number of dollars and create tax revenue, figure out how to get them clean energy, right? Like, though, that's, in my opinion, how it's really going to change.
Got it. Great.
And I'll jump in agreeing with all of that, and to say, creating those markets so clean energy and other energy sources, other technologies can compete. That's not so simple. Thinking through the regulatory environment, as we, Abby mentioned, deregulated some markets and we kind of split up the utilities to a degree. How to do that in a way that, yes, we're moving the grid cleaner and cleaner, which it's moving in that direction, but do it in a way while it obviously remains stable and is cost effective and increasingly cost effective and clean. From a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective, that's pretty exciting. That's, in my view, pretty cool. So it's, our Tuck Business School colleagues, the economists, they help design those markets. It's pretty exciting because you want the competition and the grid stability. It was not winds. We were not the major cause of the Texas blackouts, whatever that was, a couple months ago. It was more a natural gas supply problem. However, we got to avoid that in the future because of the human damage and economic damage from it. I mean, that's just unacceptable. So how to create the markets in a stable way, huge challenge.
Absolutely. Great point. Well, good. Well, I'll change gears a little bit. I'm going to actually read a question off that was posted. Fossil fuels are so cheap because they don't incorporate the cost of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Shouldn't there be carbon pricing to reflect these costs, with the proceeds being used for R&D and perhaps dividends payable to taxpayers? Thoughts on that? Darren?
Totally agree. I'm a Dartmouth trained economist. The most elegant solution for tackling climate change is to have carbon properly priced. Unfortunately, that's politically challenging at the US federal level, and certainly politically even more challenging at a global level. But there are some signs that we're willing to do that. In California, we have a low carbon fuel standard. Right now, the price on carbon is $200 a ton. When you put that type of price on and marry it with a few other government programs, what you see is a whole host of solutions coming to the fore in California that are changing the way we procure energy. So I would love to see a price on carbon. I think that would be one of the most efficient ways in the US that we would actually start tackling this problem.
Great points. Any others?
I'll jump in, and then I see Brad as well. Totally agree. It's an elegant solution. However, as you said, Majority Leader Schumer having the Democrats step forward with a carbon tax, that's a heavy lift. Democrats, taxation, that's good. So, you got to figure out these strategies for moving clean energy forward that are politically acceptable in our democracy. And that's an element, as was said earlier, the Irving Institute for Energy and society, we got to balance all of this together. Brad, what were you going to add?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in because there was another question that kind of related to it. Basically that a lot of technology has become competitive without comprehensive climate policy like a carbon price. But, and the question is totally right. Those changes are only just getting us started. We need deep reductions in CO2 emissions. How will we get there from here? I agree with both Darren and Tom. It's carbon pricing is tough politically. And frankly, it's really tough to see right now. The sort of policy approach has been at the federal level. The most palatable approach has been sort of subsidizing different clean energy technologies, research and deployment. And it's been, it's had a big impact and a surprising impact. I think, again, 15 years ago, if you had said, okay, Obama's big climate plan will fail, his EPA regulations on power plants will never get implemented, but electricity emissions will fall 40% over that time, I think it would have been a surprise to most people. So, you know, I'd like to say I think it'll be really tough without carbon pricing or some other comprehensive climate policy to really get the deep reductions we'd likely need to avert climate change. But I've also been a little surprised by a lot that's happened over the last 15 years. So maybe who knows if the sort of approach that the Biden administration and Democrats are taking now, which is more of a sort of industrial policy, you know, maybe it'll be more effective than we think. I don't know, but I agree. It seems really hard to know how we'll get deep reductions without a more comprehensive climate policy.
Maybe I can build on that and leverage one of the questions in here on spurring adoption, right? So what are the solutions here to spur adoption across the board, right? So carbon pricing, maybe that could, although politically challenging, as was mentioned. There's the consumer level, right? How do you encourage consumers to think about energy efficiency, to think about putting solar panels on their roofs, right? How do you encourage businesses, right, to move forward? And the usual answer is, well, you know, there's policy, right? Cost has to come down. Any other sort of even outside the box sort of ideas here, or it could be, you know, traditional ideas expanded on, but on how do we really spur adoption with maybe the tools in the toolbox we have at our disposal? Any thoughts on that?
We have a really interesting tool that is, how will I say it? It's in the toolbox. It just got in the toolbox. It's new. And it really is
about it.
At the intersection of technology and kind of business models. So if you think about residential solar, and which is a piece of the puzzle, I appreciated Tom's like pushing back on this binary choice that it's one or the other, right? We need everything. But if you look at the price of residential solar, about a third of the price of resi solar is attributable to permitting and timeline, right? And sort of the vagrancies of 15,000 different building authorities across the country, all of whom have a little bit different rules, a little bit different interpretations, different timelines. And that leads to customer confusion, acquisition costs, cancellations, all that stuff. So rather than pass a piece of policy or, you know, take federal control over all permitting decisions, which we thought would probably not go over well, we worked with the National Renewable Energy Labs to develop something called Solar App. And it is an online permitting process whereby if the Hanover Building Department adopts it, they use this tool available from DOE, and all of the requirements for their permit process are built into this software product. You put in I keep pointing to my roof, what your project looks like, and it either spits out a permit fairly instantaneously, or it says, nope, you got to have more area from the corners of the roof, or you need to secure it with different kinds of fasteners or whatever. But it goes from a unknown, potentially multi-month process to almost instantaneous. And that kind of sort of business model innovation and use of technology in an affirmative way and in a voluntary way, right? No one's going to be required to use this, but cities or towns can choose to use this. It's pretty amazing. And if you think about that, like, where are the other ways where we can bring that thinking together and sort of put power back in the locals, but move the process along more quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I can just say, you mentioned, DOE and the labs, funding of DOE to do some early stage R&D or examples of what Abby just said, that's a tried and true and helpful approach to catalyze some technological advances for industry to then run with.
Great. Darren, did you want to jump in?
I segment, when I think about energy, you have your electricity chain, which has a set of problems and solutions, your transportation, industrial, is kind of three big buckets. And then you think of all your tools that can go into decarbonizing. The first tool is to have economic solutions. So that's where, like in wind and solar, are already decarbonizing the electricity chain. And as we continue to move down, the battery cost curve, I think that's going to help, and so on and so forth. Another tool that we have is efficiency standards. So think about what that's done for appliances and electricity conservation. So that's an important tool that the federal government can continue to apply. We have these balkanized state and federal subsidies, but I suspect, regardless of the political climate, those will continue to proliferate. So other states are adopting the California fuel standard, Oregon, British Columbia, maybe New York, New Mexico, and so forth. So you could see almost a coalition of states. Okay, and that sets a price for carbon that really spurs, a change in a lot of ways that we procure energy. Another tool that I'm not sure I'm in favor of, but it would certainly be effective, is an internal combustion ban. Okay, so California's banning internal combustion engines, depending on your view of personal liberty and freedoms. That might be palatable or not, but it's certainly effective. And then the last one, societal pressure. So like when I think about, there's, mining companies oftentimes barely, if ever, earn their cost of capital. Okay, so they have to, squeeze out every efficiency, but you'd be amazed at the number of mining companies right now looking at using hydrogen for the big heavy trucks to try and decarbonize. Okay, and that is not a cheap solution, but they feel societal pressure to start examining this and figuring out solutions. So that's also, an important construct as well. But it takes all of that.
That's great. That's very inspiring, right? We have tools in the toolbox, right? We just have to use them in different ways in our different capacities. So that's great. There's so many questions in this to the panelists. So I'm trying to be organizing them in such a way that we get to some themes here. Maybe, and we're running out of time too. So maybe, since the theme of the conference overall is investing in our energy futures, maybe we can talk for a bit about investing, right? So you all have talked about some emerging technologies and opportunities in front of us. When we think about the investment world, and Tom mentioned the federal government investing in technologies too, so that's important here too. We think about the venture capital world, where, and maybe I'll start with Darren here. Where do you see investment in clean tech kind of going in the future? Are there new approaches to investing in these technologies that are going to help mitigate climate change, that are different from ones of the past? And we certainly need investment as part of the full equation to kind of move us forward. So how is that changing, or how does it need to change?
Well, the good news is there's tremendous capital being deployed into clean energy, both at an investment firm level and at a corporate level. Like, look at the European integrated oil companies now are deploying billions of dollars into offshore wind, hydrogen, biofuels. There's plenty of private equity capital that's been formed to invest in small startup direct air capture technologies, so on and so forth. So there is tremendous capital being deployed. And that probably is what makes me most optimistic that there will be solutions and that we'll continue to work our way down the cost curve in all of these solutions. Now, here's the bad news. Whenever there's tremendous capital being deployed into an area, returns get competed down and it gets very difficult to make money. I think there's going to be some companies that are going to be tremendous winners through all of this. And there's also going to be a lot of companies that are going to be failures, right? I see so many IPOs and startup companies that, you just know they're not all going to be successful. And so, that's the fun part of my job, is trying to figure out who's going to be successful and who has a good business plan and good business acumen, and where those opportunities are, and how you build a true business in what in many of these areas are going to become very commoditized quickly.
all great points. Tom?
If I can jump in, good with all that. And I believe Darren and others would agree that what do investors like most? To a degree, certainty of policy or certainty, some clarity of long-term policy. When we have, an administration doing regulations that come and go, that's not inducive or is not a great incentive for investors. But if we have legislation, so if we have a clearer, more definitive policy on where we're going, I think that'll bring even more investors and even better returns. So I'll just put that point out of greater clarity and certainty in the policy helps on the investing front.
Great.
I would just add just a little bit different take on the word invest. I agree with Darren and Tom, but if we think about this energy transformation and the workforce, right, we really need to be intentional and invest in this workforce. Like, folks are not just going to appear out of thin air to build tens of gigawatts of wind and solar and offshore wind. We're going to have to train them and support them and make sure that our industry is diverse and equitable. And so there's lots of things that we can do. DOE as a Department of Energy is an important partner in that, but certainly at the local level, just curriculum development and sort of partnerships with HBCUs and making sure that students understand that we have lots of engineers in the clean energy industry. We also have lots of marketing people in the clean energy industry, right? It's sort of it's an incredibly accessible industry, but I think as we think about technological advances and new financing tools, that's all important, but so are the people that will be the heart of this new industry.
Great. Well, we'll maybe stop on that note that the people are the most important piece of this. So I think that's a good place to stop. So I can't believe we're done with our hour already. I just want to thank our panelists, Tom, Abby, Brad, Darren. Thank you so much for participating in this session. I learned a lot, some key takeaways. Excitement is at the intersection, so that's great. Let's keep that in mind. We heard a lot about a variety of different technologies, wind, solar, nuclear storage, all of those, and then some. And that there are some great technologies out there, some are ahead of others, but it's really going to take a sort of diverse portfolio approach of technologies to get us there. And that policy is close to follow. And I felt really inspired to hear that there are many tools in the toolbox that are available to us to really implement some of those technologies into practice. I also heard that we need more discussion and more conversation. It's starting to happen, but as Abby said toward the end, right, that raising of awareness, the education piece, it's going to take a village, people. It's going to take all of us really to kind of continue that conversation with the people we work with, the people we live near, and move that forward. Also, in terms of government and utilities, there's some evolution happening now. There's hopefully some evolution on the horizon that will move the agenda, the energy transformation forward. And as the theme of our conference here now in terms of investing, I am hopeful to hear that there's tremendous capital being deployed. There's going to be some bumps in the road, as there always are, but that there are ways to further incentivize be it private investors or the government, or to think about the people on the other side to be incentivized to do more through that investment, that there's real opportunity in front of us. So thank you for sharing your insights with us. I want to note that there is a full slate of informative sessions today and tomorrow, calling special attention for those of you who are available to attend this evening session on energy and entrepreneurship. Should be very exciting. So thank you again, panelists. Thank you for all of you in the audience for attending. If you'd like to further discuss this topic, please visit the lounge area, where you'll be able to gather with other conference attendees for more of an informal discussion of this panel. There are such great questions, many which we didn't get to, so I'm hoping you'll be able to engage with others in the lounge to talk about these wonderful and important energy topics at one of those lounge tables. So thank you again, and have a good evening all.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.